Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julian Reyes, and I'm with the fellow with the Southwest Climate Hub. Thanks, Al, for being here, and thanks, Katie, and thanks for everyone else. Today, I'm going to present some work that I've done for the past year working with the Risk Management Agency and really doing a kind of broad data analysis project and trying to figure out what do we do with all of these data and how do we best visualize it, what kind of interesting research questions can we answer with these data, and how do we best provide that data to our stakeholders and to our partners. So the primary motivation of this project really falls under the Climate Hub's mission, which some of you know of, but if you don't know, the Hub's mission is to develop and deliver science-based, region-specific information and technologies to ag and natural resource managers to really enable climate-informed decision-making. So this image shows the Climate Hub regions, and so we're obviously located in southern New Mexico, and we include Hawaii, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and sometimes California. And so that was the primary motivation, but really we want to look at these publicly available crop insurance data to assess past climate risks related to different causes of loss. And so by causes of loss, I mean maybe heat or drought or freeze or frost. And so crop insurance is not an insignificant issue. In 2016, more than $100 billion worth of crops were insured, and about $4 billion were paid out in indemnities to farmers. Crop insurance essentially provides a safety net for farmers against potential perils like drought and heat, like I mentioned. And in a changing climate, farmers' premiums may not be adequate in these higher production risk areas. So you can see the first report by the Government Accountability Office looking at these higher crop production risk areas. And moreover, these higher risk areas may increase the federal government's fiscal exposure. So really our guiding question is, what can crop insurance data tell us about weather and climate impacts on agriculture? And so really, what is the link between crop insurance and weather and climate impacts, and how do we parse out those linkages? And our expected outcomes are, one, to inform future risk management agency programs, provide regionally relevant information, and to provide potential targeted adaptation in particular counties. So a little bit of crop insurance 101. So you have three different groups here. We have the farmers, the private insurance companies, there are about 19 in the country, and then the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation, the FCIC, which is run through the Risk Management Agency. And so essentially producers will pay a portion of a total premium to insurance companies based off of where they're located and what crop they're growing. And part of that is subsidized through the federal government. About 62% of their premium is subsidized by the federal government. And then farmers will receive an indemnity when revenue or production falls below a certain threshold. And the FCIC, the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation, essentially covers any gains or losses for these private insurance companies. And so this is kind of the framework that we've used for this data analysis project. So with data analysis also comes visualization. It's kind of an iterative process. So we took a three-pronged approach. Our first objective really looks at the RMA data by cause of loss, and then by crop over different spatial and temporal scales, really to look at what's there and what's some interesting questions in the data. And our second objective is more of a research objective, is to describe trends in payments and any possible links with weather and climate. Then our last one is to provide accessible and discoverable data to stakeholders and partners. And you can see where these three objectives fall in this kind of, I don't know what you would call it, between visualization and analysis, exploratory to really clarify what our question is at hand, and really explanatory, how do we communicate these to others. And so we can first take a look at these nationwide indemnities. So between 2001 and 2016, almost $100 billion worth of indemnities were paid out to farmers. And so that's not equal if you start looking at it by cause of loss. So the top 5 causes of loss are drought in this dark orange, excess moisture or precipitation in the dark purple, hail, heat, and then freeze. And so those top 5 causes of loss make up about 85% of that $100 billion worth of indemnities. And then the next 5 are cold, wet weather, wind, excess wind, failure in irrigation supply, the light green, and then hot wind and flood. And I would like to mention that these indemnities are for non-revenue related. So these are the ones that are climate related. But these indemnities are also not equal across commodities or crops. And so this lists the fraction of total indemnities from 2001 to 2016 by different commodities. So unsurprisingly, corn, wheat, soybeans, cotton, and grain make up the top 5 crops for this time period. But then the next 5, which is interesting, tobacco, sunflowers, rice, apples, and peanuts, they make up, I think, less than 3% of the nationwide indemnities for the same time period. So you can imagine that those nationwide indemnities are not the same when you start looking at it by region. And so I break down these indemnities by region using the climate hub region. So the Northwest, Northern Plains, Midwest, Northeast, Southwest, Southern Plains, and Southeast. And again, I use the same color scale for the top 10 causes of loss, and we're looking at the fraction of the total regional indemnities by cause of loss. And so you can see that drought in the dark orange makes up a very large portion of total of regional indemnities across most regions, but you can see some differences. So the Southwest, for example, is really different. They're always different, right? So you can see that a lot of different causes of loss don't even break 20%. And so that's probably due to the diversity of crops grown in this area. But some areas are predominantly drought, so the Midwest, for example, and then you have the Southeast, which is mostly drought and excess moisture. And so if we take the Southwest as an example, here we plot the total indemnities for that same time period for the top 15 crops. And so here you have the top crops. You can see wheat, corn, and cotton, unsurprisingly, are the top 3 crops for the Southwest. But then since we include California, you can see some of the fruits and nuts. You see almonds, cherries, grapes, pistachios, and prunes. And then we can also look at the causes of loss for these particular crops. So for example, for wheat, over half of the cause of loss is due to drought. But if you look at cotton, unsurprisingly, it's due to failure in irrigation supply because they need a lot of water. And so the Southwest is interesting. So we can look at the fraction of total indemnities from 2001 to 2016 by cause of loss for the Southwest versus the nation. So the Southwest is in the solid bar while the rest of the nation is kind of this semi-transparent. So you can see there's less drought in the Southwest, but more of this failure in irrigation supply due to the amount of irrigation needed for our crops in this region. And you can see we have more excess wind and a bit more heat reported as causes of loss. And so we can dig down even deeper to the county level, and we can report the top county cause of loss from 2001 to 2016. And again, I use the same top 10 causes of loss for the nation. What's interesting is that there are some areas where these top 10 causes of loss don't pop up. So for example, in Florida, you see a lot of dark gray areas. That's because their top cause of loss is actually hurricanes and tropical depressions, which makes sense. But in Massachusetts, for example, it's actually plant disease. And so you can start to parse out these spatial differences when you start looking at these data over different spatial scales. And so now that we looked at different spatial scales, these cause of loss data at the national scale, regional, and county, we can ask, well, what do these causes of loss look like over time? And so these show annual indemnities from 2001 to 2016. These are absolute values for the same top 10 causes of loss. And so you can obviously see a big spike in 2012 during the height of the drought in North America, so between 2011 and 2014, by the size of the dark orange bar for drought. And you can also start to see some appearances of that green for the failure in irrigation supply, which is mostly in the Southwest. And then there are some instances of hot wind in 2011 and 2012. And so we can also look at those annual indemnities by region. And so this is the annual regional indemnities from 2001 to 2016 by cause of loss. And these are in hundreds of millions of dollars. And so it's important to note that the y-axes for these different plots are different because the amount of indemnities received are quite different by region. So obviously the Midwest has the highest range from 0 to 80, while the Northeast is the lowest from 0 to 1.5 millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars. And here you can also see the effects of drought, mostly between 2011 and 2014. There's some sort of spike in either the orange or green bars. So here, for example, in Northern Plains, you see that spike in the orange around 2011, 2012. But then in the Southwest, it's a little bit different, where instead of orange, you see green and red. And again, that's primarily due to the amount of irrigated crops in this region. And then let's see. Then for that hot wind, we see that's primarily in the Southern Plains, which is Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas? Yeah. And so moving on to our research approach. So this is more for our second objective. So now that we've seen these trends over time, we can ask, well, are these trends significant? How do we parse that out, that significance, or whether there is an actual trend happening? So we have a two-pronged research approach. Our first objective is to assess the trends in indemnities over time, essentially. So are there these trends, rising trends in indemnities related to cause of loss? And are these trends significant over different spatial scales, so by county, state, or by region? And our second objective is to link these indemnity trends with weather and climate variables at the state level. So essentially, are these indemnity trends correlated with any climate variables? So like a drought index, like the Palmer Drought Severity Index, PDSI, or just the regular temperature or precip variables. And then that last question is really asking, to what extent are these impacts from weather and climate expressed in these indemnities? So again, trying to parse out that linkage between indemnities and weather and climate impacts. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to go over the first research approach. So if we take the Southwest as an example again, for the 6 Southwest mainland states, you can see that here you have the 6 states, Arizona, California, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, and Utah, from 2001 to 2016. So you can see that California and Colorado make up a very large portion of most indemnities in the Southwest. And so California is in the light blue, and Colorado is in the dark green. And that you can see the rise in indemnities around the period of drought. And the period of drought mostly affected wheat in Colorado, and then a lot of the specialty crops in California during that time period. And you can see barely Nevada and New Mexico in the kind of salmon and goldenrod color respectively. But you can also parse out these data by cause of loss, as I mentioned. And so here we have annual indemnities by cause of loss using the same color scheme. And here we can look at drought, heat, failure in irrigation supply, excess moisture in the dark purple, hail, cold, wet weather, and freeze. And again, you can see that for the size of the bubble, which represents the amount of indemnity, you can see that the size of the bubble increased around between 2012 and 2014, especially for the red, so heat, drought, and failure in irrigation supply. And these are in millions of dollars. And so to look at these trends in normalized indemnities, we had to normalize these. And so by normalizing, we essentially divided indemnities by the acreage affected. And so to look at these trends, we use the Mann-Kendall test. And so that basically tells you the magnitude and direction of a monotonic trend. So for example, if you have this kind of figure going up, that's an increasing monotonic trend versus a decreasing monotonic trend over time. And so we can look at how cause of loss by state and whether there is a trend in those indemnities from 2001 to 2016. So in general, what we find is that there are increasing trends of normalized indemnities across all causes of loss and across most states. And so the gray boxes represent there weren't enough data to calculate a trend. And then when there's a value in a box, that represents a significant trend using the Mann-Kendall test. And we also find that significant Mann-Kendall trends occur in all 6 Southwest states for failure in irrigation supply. So that third most column for failure in irrigation supply, all the dark red. And that's unsurprising since a lot of the crops are irrigated here, and that's kind of a proxy for drought. Yes?
Is that failure in irrigation supply surface or groundwater? Or both?
I don't know the exact rules, but I would want to say surface. I'll look into that. But it is essentially a proxy for drought. If there's not water, then that's what they'll report. There's also a failure in irrigation equipment, but we don't report that. And that is fairly insignificant, I think. But that's a good question. Yeah, so that result is unsurprising. It helps confirm that we can use the Mann-Kendall test for this. But it is important to note that these trends might be dependent on the scale of aggregation. So we're aggregating by state. We could get different results if we aggregate by crop, which we didn't. We also see increasing trends. And we know that there are issues with using absolute indemnities since the commodity price will change over time. And so we're looking at perhaps using the relative proportion of the cause of loss increasing or decreasing over time as a way to get around that. But nonetheless, it's still interesting to see these results just by using data that are available. So I went over the first objective, which was to kind of discover what's available in these data. The second objective, to kind of describe what trends are going on and whether some of those trends are significant. And our third objective is really to provide accessible and discoverable data to our stakeholders and partners. And so with that, we got a lot of help from Jeb Williamson, who kind of built up this cool website for us to provide on-the-fly information. Essentially, you can pick a county or state, whether you want monthly or annual data, and you can pick your different variables of interest, whether you want you want to look at only heat causes of loss, or you want to look at drought, or you only want to look at pecans, for example. And so this online tool called the RMA Data Viewer, Jeb created for us so that our partners and stakeholders can essentially take these data that are not really in an accessible format to really visualize it. And eventually we'd like to provide user-defined parameters so folks can just download, I don't know, 10 years of data instead of no data. And so I wanted to do a quick, if the internet works, show you the tool that Jeb created. That might be possible. And so the thing I didn't explain with the data is that there are maybe 3 or 4 different data sets, and some data do have that reported, but we may lose, like, for example, we may not have the cause of loss tied to that. And so that is something we could do also, or we can also use maybe the expected crop value. That's another type of metric we could use to get around the issue of changing commodity prices. Another one is called the loss ratio. And so that's the indemnity, so the payment made out to the farmer divided by the premium they pay. And so the loss ratio essentially tells us if we get a larger loss ratio over time, that means the federal government's on the hook for more losses. So yeah, I think acres, that might be another way around it as well. And so I didn't mention that the Farm Service Agency, FSA, also does crop insurance. And so then I know they have data reported in acres affected.
So the other idea that just popped into my head of what acres affected could tease out of there any trends in people planting crops expecting them to fail.
Because if you plant something, then you're that would be interesting. Yeah, there are some lines in the data of like 0.1 acre, probably just to get crop insurance. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Any other questions? Yeah, crop insurance is a really interesting and is highly politicized. But there's a really great Congressional Research Service report. If you just Google crop insurance, CRS, and there's 2 really great reports that you can read about the background. They're pretty short. And they take a non-biased approach at describing the program. But this is the great tool that Jeb created for us for viewing the crop insurance data. And so if you got, this is the website. It's southwestclimatehub.info/RMA. So this part should usually be on the right side. But essentially, you could, okay, so this is just weird. So anyways, so let's say you were interested in a particular county. I could click this county in California, that's Fresno, and I can get some data from there. So if I click this, I can see that cotton is the #1 crop that's reported as a cause of loss here in Fresno County, but I can also see the top causes of loss if I scroll down or not. And so you can see failure of irrigation supply as a top cause of loss in Fresno County. And so if you go back, my one example I wanted to show was pecans. It's like always the one example. Okay, so if I wanted to look at pecans, I can go here. So I can, not only can I look at by county, I can change the metric. So I can look at acres affected or the indemnity. I can also change the time period of which the data I want to look at. I can also pick particular commodities. So we list the top 5 commodities here, but we can also pick pecan. So there's a lot of different commodities. So I can choose pecans. So when the map updates, it shows us the counties with pecans as with a reported cause of loss. And so unsurprisingly, Georgia, which is I think #1 in pecan production by state, and then we see New Mexico, some counties in Texas and Arizona. So that's unsurprising. And so if we pick Doña County, we can see for that time period there's been about $4.6 million in indemnities related to pecans. And then we can also see what the top cause of loss for pecans were. So it's primarily hail, wind, and then freezing heat. And you can see these data over time, so by year and also by month. And then if you click a particular year, that changes the cause of loss and then the monthly totals. And so this is just an example of how to use the tool, and we hope eventually we'll provide some sort of user-defined parameters so that you can download the data you want. And people can also provide feedback, which is very important. So you can say, oh, I want something else instead. And so I'll receive that, and we can try to incorporate that. Yeah, I think that's all I had.
I got a question.
Sure.
When I was looking at down the end of the data for the crop loss and all the other ones, where was alfalfa at? I never saw alfalfa up there. Is it not like commonly insured because it's animal feed primarily, or like? Because I was just wondering. I thought alfalfa was like a huge crop here.
And so it could, yeah, so there's two things with that. So RMA is only, the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation is only a subset of what people can insure. So it could be under FSA data, the federal, like the Farm Service Agency, but it could also be under a different commodity name. They may not call it alfalfa. There's another one called pasture, range, and forage. So that it could have been listed under that, for example. Yeah, but that's a great question. That's another way for us to evaluate to make sure our tool is working right, or ask those questions like, why isn't it there? Or so it could have been under a different commodity name. So if I go back here, you can see that some of the commodities have some strange names. But yeah, so there is alfalfa. Yeah, and there's annual forage. So there's a variety that could be under. But just to show you, there is that pasture, range, and forage. So it could be under that.
It's crazy that the federal government insures tobacco.
Yeah, and the #1 county for tobacco production is around here. Anyways, yeah.
Are there other tools that like a farmer might use to kind of generate some early warning? I mean, I think in the Southwest where we know beforehand whether or not what our irrigation situation is going to be like, I guess. Does that drive what people plant, whether or not they plant alfalfa or some less water-hungry crop here?
So that I'm unsure of. So I'm sure there are tools out there, but this is mostly kind of the end result, right? So like whatever they do, most likely they will plant something. That's how it works with crop insurance. As long as you plant something, you'll get some sort of money back. So that's why it is interesting to look at these indemnities over time to see, are you seeing more and more losses over time? Because that's a message that it's a higher crop, production risk area. And so that gets into a kind of a gray area. You're going to start saying, well, maybe you shouldn't be planting certain things, and maybe that's what they're relying on, right? But
I bet they would, like farmers probably would like that. Like you should have been told.
Yeah. But these data that we're looking at, they're just available as CSV files on the RMA website, but they're really, it would take you would need to have a powerful computer to really analyze those data, even in Excel. So we're trying to make those data accessible. And there are other RMA tools for for particular programs where farmers could go and look at to see what their production history looks like, or how has indemnities been paid out, but not to the extent we've done, especially with cause of loss. So that's kind of the climate portion of it. But yeah, that's a good question.